Have you ever wondered how games today look so damn beautiful? Even games made by smaller teams these days can look stunning. Except for this one, which was made by a team of 50? Sorry. Even games made by smaller teams these days can look stunning. So it got me thinking, how do video games go from looking like this to this? Because 3 months ago, I decided to make my first realistic looking game. You see, I've been a professional game developer for 10 years, but we've only made 2D games. Our last one being an automation game called Atrio: The Dark Wild, where you capture creatures and add them to your assembly line, available now on Steam and Xbox. Should buy it? Just saying. So I tried to create realistic graphics, but between the acronyms, the endless labyrinth of settings, the infinite number of programs, I thought my brain was going to explode. Even as an expert with a decade of Unity experience, it was hard. But now that I've done the work, I have decided to create the beginner's guide to creating realistic graphics in Unity. So if you're just curious to know how devs make beautiful games, or if you're a beginner like me trying to create your first realistic looking game, this is the video for you. I'm also hoping that this video can act as an overview to guide you on what to focus on before you waste all that time researching a topic. And once you're ready to deep dive, I've included some helpful tutorials in the description below. So it turns out creating realistic graphics is dead simple. With today's modern technology, you can open up Blender and make a hyper-realistic donut within 5 hours. Here's mine, which means anyone can create realistic AAA graphics, if you don't mind setting your computer on fire. And it's a game about spinning donuts. These 60 frames took 30 minutes to render on my 2080 Ti, which is 0.03 frames per second. Games run at 60 frames per second, which means we need to render 2,000 times more frames per second. What gives? Well, all of these acronyms, programs, and confusion are there to solve one thing: performance. I'm going to focus on techniques that improve performance as well as covering the basics. Let's dive in. When it comes to creating graphics, there are 3 major categories: modeling, materials, and lighting. And each topic builds upon each other to help create beautiful environments. So let's start with modeling. If you're new to 3D modeling, it's just about creating geometric shapes that go into the world. Here's the Batmobile from 2022's Batman, starring Robert Pattinson. And if you're like, that's not that complicated, well, you're kind of right. It's really just a collection of points in space that form polygons. But it's the foundation to create something beautiful. And even though the concept is very simple, creating good 3D models takes an enormous amount of skill and practice. Luckily, there are so many good tutorials online. So I'm gonna link some good tutorials below and mostly skip this section. I did want to touch on one topic: level of detail, or LOD for short. In video games, the more triangles your computer has to display, the more taxing it is on your computer. So having one super detailed donut is probably fine, but try showing 1,000 donuts? Well, now your computer's on fire. So what you can do is model the same object in different levels of detail, and Unity will automatically swap models depending on how far it is from you. And if you want beautiful graphics, this is a must. Every game, from Call of Duty to Genshin Impact, does this. Some better than others. I've linked a great tutorial below on how to create your own LOD meshes, but let's keep going. There are also some Unity plugins that will automatically create LODs for you. Now, I haven't used them myself, but I do plan on checking them out. Lastly, you're going to need to learn how to model. Lots of pros use Maya, but I can confidently say Blender is the best place to start. It's free, it works great, and there are so many tutorials online. All right, moving on to materials. Materials give a 3D object color and texture, and in Unity, this is what a material looks like. From the materials menu, you can adjust the texture property parameters to create all sorts of cool visuals. Smoothness makes stuff shinier. The normal map makes it bumpier, and you can even change the color. I'll explain this in more detail, but first, let's talk about performance. Let's say we wanted a cube made out of bricks, and as a total beginner, I was thinking this model would look like this. You'd add the bumps and go from there, right? Wrong. Turns out having 12,000 triangles on a single cube sets your computer on fire. So some brilliant computer scientists back in the 90s figured out how to do this with just 12 triangles. 12! Let me explain. These little squares are called texture properties. They control the properties like bumpiness, like I showed you before. And they're just regular old JPEGs, which is kind of confusing. Like, why is this one blue and purple? But stay with me, okay? The left one is called albedo, also known as the base color, the diffuse map, or the base map. It's confusing, I know. But it's the texture of the object. There's smoothness that changes how rough or smooth surfaces are, where the lighter sections will be more rough and the darker sections will be smoother. The normal maps, fake bumps and grooves in the texture. And combining them together gets this, which looks mostly real at a fraction of the computing cost. And I know that went really fast, so here's a little cheat sheet for you. Take a screenshot and come back to it when you're ready. If you're anything like me, you want to skip the details and just texture your model. And if you're anything like me, you've mastered the art of 3D modeling, but have decided to texture a cube instead because you're definitely not embarrassed of the monstrosity you've created. So Let's do that. There are 3 main ways to get materials. I found the online option to be the easiest, so we're gonna start with that. The Unity Asset Store is one of the many places you can get physically based rendering textures, or PBR textures for short. That's where these bad boys come from. The collection of these images form a PBR. All you gotta do is head over to the website, purchase a material, and import it into Unity where it just kinda works out of the box. It's really nice. The only issue is that almost all of the good materials cost money. On the other hand, websites like Ambient CG are completely free and help us better understand how materials actually work, but require more steps. Let's focus on Ambient CG. Once you find a material you like, Ambient CG lets you preview what each part of the PBR does. Here it is with just a normal map, which controls the bumps on the object, and here it is with a texture. So if you like it, all you gotta do is download it. Then you have your images. Voila! Now on the right is Blender's shading tab, where you build your materials. And all we have to do is apply it to our cube, which is so simple. So first we hook up the color to the base color, and the roughness to the roughness, and then the ambient occlusion to... Wait, there's 2 normals? Okay, that's confusing. Why don't we take a look at Unity? Okay, there's nowhere for color, and none of them match, except for the normals, but there's 2 normals. The only thing that looks close is ambient occlusion and occlusion map. And they're probably the same, but like a sausage and a sausage party are 2 totally different things. Just one extra word. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. And to make matters worse, Blender to Unity doesn't match either. Like, excuse me? Okay, so here I was 3 months in, and there's no cohesive tutorial explaining all of this, or any of it. But luckily for you, I figured it out. There are 2 tools that convert everything for you. Node Wrangler, an official Blender add-on, takes your downloaded materials and hooks up everything for you. I've linked a great tutorial in the description below, but basically once you install it, you hit Shift-T, select the materials, and boom, it's hooked up. Now you can manually export the textures from Blender to Unity, but it sucks. It is so confusing, and it is so not worth it. So I found this Blender add-on called Simple Bake. Now there's lots of great add-ons that do the same thing, but this one works for me. And yes, it's 20 Canadian dollars, but it took me legitimately 7 hours to learn how to manually export. And Simple Bake does it with a couple of clicks. So for me, it's been well worth the price. And I've linked some awesome tutorials below, so go check them out. So with all of those tools, you can now grab a texture online, apply it to a 3D model, and get it into Unity, which is awesome. Okay, so what if you want to make your own materials? Well, to be honest, I haven't done this yet. I've messed around a little in Blender, but from what I've heard, Substance Painter is the best of the best. But it's like $250 on Steam, so I haven't had the courage to buy it yet. I've also listed some other ones based on my research, but again, haven't tried them. You can also apparently scan materials, but that would require me going outside. Yuck. So I haven't tried Materialize, but it's free and apparently quite good. Again, all of these linked below. I hope that helps. But we want realistic graphics. So that's not where we're gonna stop. We don't want to just create a basic material. We want to create a whole environment. So I kept digging, and this is where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean complicated, but welcome to game dev. I found this official Unity tutorial that comes with a sample project called the Spotlight Tunnel. It's available to download, check it out down below, and it looks pretty good. Not quite as good as my magnum opus, but still worth exploring. So I start digging around, and I notice there's a lot of reused parts. And reusing parts seems pretty common sense, but there's actually more to it than you think. Buckle up, buccos, we're getting technical. So let's say we have a 4K texture, or 4096 pixels wide by 4096 pixels tall. That's roughly 10 megabytes. Remember these little squares? Well, all of them combined make a single material. And if each texture property has its own JPEG, and if each JPEG is about 10 megabytes, one material is about 50 megabytes. That would be for one piece of the level. And if each piece of the level has its own material, and you have several levels, well now you have a computer that's on fire. So what if instead of one material for each object, many pieces have the same material? We could effectively go from gigs of space to megabytes. Incredible. Okay, so we've managed to squeeze out some performance, but we're not done. I kept thinking, this scene has 26 materials. Could we take it any further? What if we managed to squeeze it all down to a single material? It would probably just look like TF2 CP Orange, right? Just a bunch of orange squares, right? Outside of the plants, everything in this scene comes from a single 2K material. Everything you see change on screen shares that single material. But like what? How? Well, it turns out each model can choose to use a section of the material. So here's a wall with a bunch of 3D models. You got the window, which grabs from this part of the material. You got these ornate decorations that grab from here. And this pillar uses the same ornate decorations, the bricks, and these. I mean, he creates arches, walls, doors, windows, corners, frames, decos, and trims. You can go from gigs of space to 50 megabytes. And that is the power of creating a trim sheet. Now, you obviously can't use it everywhere, but you get the point. It's awesome. So at this point, I'm feeling good. This all looks familiar. I know what a base map, metallic map, normal map is. I fucking shifted the smoothness dial to make stuff shiny. I'm on it. And then I notice that their texture parameters are green. This isn't green. Nobody in any tutorial has mentioned green before. And to make matters worse, these two are the same pictures. Like what? Why in God's name would they? Introducing the green squares, or the more technical term, channel packing. It's time to understand how these pictures actually work. Let's back up from the green squares, start simple, and focus our attention on the occlusion map. Ambient occlusion is a performant way to fake shadows, mostly in little cracks and creases. It's fairly subtle, but adds nice details while still being performant. As you can see, all of the black sections get a fake shadow applied to it, and the white does nothing. So if I took this random sprite and swapped it in, you'd get this. Now your computer doesn't think of them as pictures, they see them in terms of pixels, where each pixel has a value between 0 and 1. 0 is black and tells your computer to add fake shadows, 0.5 is a little bit of shadow, and 1 says don't add any shadows. Now a bunch of texture properties work like this. Height maps, for example, will fake height on a texture. This pebble material is a great example. You can see how it fakes a bit of height. The dark sections are low points, the light sections are high points, and it's even better illustrated with a height map that's just a big ol' square. Obviously it looks terrible, but it shows it off. And the point I'm trying to make is that the computer sees each pixel as a value between 0 and 1. This is important because JPEGs are not black and white, and the computer doesn't just see them as a single value, they actually have a red value between 0 and 1, a blue value between 0 and 1, and a green value between 0 and 1. And some brilliant computer scientist thought, well, if we have 3 black and white images, then we could fit one black and white image into all of the red values, one black and white image into all of the blue values, and a final black and white image into the green values, which is how we get these green texture properties. And it doesn't make sense to the human eye, but the computer understands all of the information that's packed in it. And that's why it's called channel packing. What a huge optimization. There's all kinds of cool stuff you can do, like if you have black and white decals for an environment, you could pack them together into a single texture and use them in your game. And a quick tip, the Simple Bake add-on I talked about earlier does this channel packing for you. Another reason I recommend it. Woo! Congratulations, you've made it through the materials section. And the good news is the technical and confusing part is now about to begin, because we're talking about lighting. I'm of the opinion that lighting is the most important piece to achieving realism, and the piece that the industry is still trying to figure out. This is the scene with properly applied materials. And here it is with lighting. Lighting can turn a game like Minecraft into a whole new experience. And don't tell me that doesn't look good. Now, in order to understand lighting, we first need to talk about rendering pipelines. A render pipeline takes objects in a scene and displays it on screen. Unreal has its own render pipeline, Godot has its own render pipeline, and Unity has 4 pipelines. Oh, but don't worry, it's easy to compare the pipelines with this easy to read chart. How does a beginner figure any of this out? Now, I've linked some very detailed videos on how to choose a pipeline below. That way I can make some gross oversimplifications and you can't blame me. First, I'm gonna skip over the built-in render pipeline. It's Unity's original pipeline, and honestly, it gets the job done. Atrio was built on it, and I think Atrio looks fantastic. So great that you can find it on Steam for purchase right now. Anyway, Unity took the original and they forked it into 3 pipelines: URP, HDRP, and your own custom pipelines. While I was researching, I found that Inside, one of 2016's best indie games, was built in Unity. And based on this GDC talk where they are talking about topics I've never been able to comprehend, I'm guessing it's using its own custom pipeline. So unless you're some kind of technical wizard with a big budget, this probably isn't the route for you, which leaves URP and HDRP. The oversimplified advice: URP is the jack of all trades. It produces great graphics, but it also lets you port to mobile and lower end PCs. Whereas HDRP is specifically built for modern PCs and next-gen consoles. But I wanted to compare apples to apples, and it turns out that Unity's official sample project is available for both pipelines. And you can see HDRP is brighter, has more contrast, better bloom, but they both look pretty good. And if we're being completely honest, if your next project looks like this, it's because you're a rookie, not because you chose the wrong render pipeline. Just saying. Okay, let's finally talk about lighting. Starting with the mother of all lights, the sun.
It's me, the sun.
The sun shoots laser beams called light rays. Anything lit up from a direct hit is called direct lighting. Old games like Virtua Fighter and Super Mario 64 only used direct lighting. However, in real life, these light rays bounce. Everything lit up by those secondary rays is called indirect lighting. This is important because indirect lighting is what makes a scene realistic. It's what took us from Doom to Quake. Those soft, gradiented shadows come from indirect lighting. But even with today's computers, it's very performance heavy. For example, Blender has a direct lighting mode, and it's wicked fast. But if you switch to the indirect lighting mode, it's so slow. But video games run at 60 frames per second with indirect lighting. So what gives? Well, we sacrifice some realism for performance. Let's imagine we're in an underground parking lot. How does a game engine figure out how to light this caution sign? The trick is that instead of starting from the light source and bouncing around until we find the sign, we start from the model and shoot rays towards the light sources. You'll see in a minute. To explain, let's break the scene up into little squares called texels. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to focus on this one little texel. But keep in mind, when we talk about lighting a scene and how it affects performance, that there are light rays shooting out from every texel, going in almost every direction for every single frame. Let's shoot a ray from this texel towards our light source. No bounces, just a single ray. If the ray hits the light, we know the texel will be lit up. The more light sources it hits, the brighter it'll be. Now, if we cover the sign will be completely black, which isn't realistic. Why? Because light bounces. And if the bounces hit a light source, we add a little bit of light, and this starts to look more realistic. The more bounces we allow, the more realistic the scene becomes. However, it slows down the computer. And, going back to our simple example, if you add a second light, you have to double the amount of rays the game engine has to calculate. And if you were so bold to add a third light, you have now tripled your rays. And if you have indirect lighting on top of that, well, now your computer's on fire. So Unity lets you choose between two options. If you only want direct lighting, it's called basic real-time lighting, and it's on by default. But if you want indirect lighting, you would use baked lighting. Yeah, but Steven, you just said that indirect lighting sets your computer on fire, which is true. However, someone figured this out. What if we did all of this light tracing shenanigans before the game was even shipped? This process of pre-calculating the light is called light baking. First introduced by Quake 1 back when computers were just glorified toasters, it completely changed how games were made. You can see that Tomb Raider and Quake came out the same year and are running at the same frame rate, but one looks way better than the other. In Unity, there's this nice little generate lighting button that pre-calculates the direct and indirect lighting and stores how bright each texel is inside of a picture. That way, it knows how bright everything is ahead of time, and the performance gains are huge. Now, light baking is a deep rabbit hole, so I created some cheat sheets based on some tutorials and link them below. Take a screenshot, come back later. Great, so that's lighting in a nutshell, right? Of course not! Silly fool! In video games, stuff moves. If we move the sign to the left, well, there's still a shadow there because we pre-calculated everything. So you could use basic real-time lighting. It works during runtime because it only sends out a single ray, but it doesn't look very realistic. And of course, baked lighting isn't gonna work either. So I kind of lied. There's a third option, mixed lighting, which has been one of the biggest lighting innovations in recent years. These yellow dots on screen are light probes and are pre-calculated by Unity to quickly tell you how dark or light a spot in that world is. So this spot says, hey, this point in the world is really dark, and this spot is really bright. So when you're running around, you sample the nearby probes to figure out how to light up your character. Now, all of the non-moving objects are still using baked lighting, so you still get that sweet, sexy realism, while moving objects still look pretty good, while also not leaving wacky shadows on the floor. All you have to do is drop the light probes into a scene, press a button, and Unity generates the probes for you. Last little bonus thing, let's talk about reflection probes really quickly. Let's say your character is wearing a shiny piece of armor, and you want that reflection to update as you move. It's almost like the exact same thing as light probes, where you can sample the probe to figure out what your reflection should look like without having to do any of the calculating during runtime. Again, another deep rabbit hole, so I've linked some tutorials below. Whew, we did it. We got through the 3 different types of lighting. Except I lied, there's more. Someone had the audacity to say, what if instead of the character moving, what if the lights moved? As if that's a realistic scenario that happens every day. Oh God. I guess the sun changes things from day to night, so introducing real-time global illumination, or GI for short. Can you see why I was confused? Okay, so with GI, light maps are gone. Get out of here. Instead, everything is lit using light probes. It's more expensive, but you can move lights and characters around. So there you have it. The 4 ways to light your game.
Oh God, there's 6?
It just keeps going, baby. Luckily, they're just variations of mixed lighting, and it's a little setting you pick in Unity, so I'm gonna skip them. I've put together this oversimplified cheat sheet, and yes, it is oversimplified, but I mean, if you're starting out, it's better than reading through all the documentation like I had to do. Now to wrap up, I wanted to show a visual representation of the different light modes. Now just keep in mind as I go through this scene, they are used for different things. Obviously, mixed lighting in real-time GI looks way better than basic real-time, but basic real-time is very performant, and it's a heck of a lot easier to set up than mixed lighting or real-time GI. No light probes, no light maps, none of that fuss, you just kind of throw it in. The point I'm trying to make is it's a deep rabbit hole, and each of them has their pros and cons. Congratulations to making it this far, and if you've gone this far, I figured you might be curious to know what kind of tech is coming in the future. And it's really, really cool. The biggest one is ray tracing. I'm sure you've heard of it. It is way slower, but way more realistic, and actually by far the simplest to set up. No light probes, no light maps, and it supports day-night cycles and moving characters. Unity just sends out rays every frame and sets your computer on fire. Unity's ray tracing is not production ready, and I'm not sure if I set it up properly, but it looks pretty good despite it being noticeably more taxing on your computer. In fact, the tech is so new that games like Cyberpunk only did partial ray tracing, with the rest being done via mixed lighting. But that's about to change because Black Myth Wukong, which just came out, has full ray tracing and it is stunning. But that's not all. There's even more cutting-edge technology coming out, with path tracing. From what I understand, it's still a version of ray tracing, but with a more complicated formula that makes everything look better. And Unity has a preview version of path tracing available to try. I tested it out myself, and it's definitely early days. Anytime you move around the world, it produces a ton of noise. But when the computer has time to catch up, you can definitely see a difference in quality between ray tracing and path tracing. And if you're curious as to how this all fits together, I stole this chart from a Unity GDC talk that's linked down below that does a nice job of comparing them all. And I know I didn't cover how to do most of this stuff, but when I was trying to learn with so many options, I just wanted to know which path to take before watching the billions of tutorials out there. So I hope this helps. Good luck with your journey. Go make some amazing video games.